The fire was burning out, just a faint glow behind the blackened logs. But Daisy wouldn't stop staring. Her golden fur shimmered in the dim light, her ears perked, her body frozen except for the rhythmic rise and fall of her breath. "Daisy, what is it, girl?" I asked, kneeling beside her, running a hand along her back. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her eyes were locked onto the empty hearth like she was waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. The house was quiet, except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock and the crackling embers. Outside, the wind whistled through the trees, rustling the last of the fallen leaves across the front porch. My parents were asleep upstairs, and my little brother Ben was out cold in his room, exhausted from his football practice earlier that day. I glanced back at the fireplace. It was just a fireplace. The same one we'd gathered around for as long as I could remember. It had warmed our home through every Christmas, every snowstorm, every time the power went out, and we told stories in the dark. But something about Daisy's posture made my stomach twist. I reached out and ran my fingers over the bricks, searching for anything unusual. Loose stone? A draft? Maybe a mouse had crawled inside. But there was nothing. The space was empty, just the charred remains of the firewood from earlier in the evening. Daisy let out a low whimper. Not the kind that begged for food or attention. It was deeper. Sadder. Like she knew something I didn't. "Come on, girl. There's nothing there," I whispered, giving her a soft tug on the collar. She didn't budge. Her tail remained stiff, her breathing slow and controlled. I sighed and leaned back on my heels, debating if I should just leave her be. But then something shifted. It wasn't a noise, not exactly. More like the air itself changed, thickening just enough to raise the hairs on my arms. And then I heard it. A sound so faint I almost thought I imagined it. A whisper. No, not a whisper. A breath. I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. Daisy stood up, her stance firm, her tail now flicking with unease. My mind raced for explanations. A draft? The wind sneaking in through the chimney? But the doors were locked, the windows shut. The fire was nearly dead, nothing but smoldering ash. I swallowed hard and leaned in again. My pulse pounded in my ears, and every instinct screamed at me to walk away. But something deep inside, something just as strong as the fear, pulled me forward. "Hello?" Nothing. I reached for the fire poker, gripping the cold metal tight as I nudged the logs. Ash swirled up, a ghostly cloud against the darkened bricks. I coughed and waved a hand in front of my face. Still, nothing. Daisy whined again, louder this time, desperate. Her paws scratched against the wooden floor, her body shifting from foot to foot. She was nervous. And then, before I could react, she lunged, straight into the fireplace. "Daisy, no!" I barely had time to grab her before she burrowed her nose into the ashes, her paws scraping at the soot-covered bricks. She wasn't just sniffing. She was digging. Desperate, frantic digging. I dropped the poker and pulled her back, but she wriggled free, her determination unshakable. I reached into the mess she'd made, my fingers running over the brickwork, feeling for whatever had her so riled up. My hand stopped on something small and cold, wedged into the cracks. I pulled it free, my breath catching in my throat. A tiny rusted locket. My fingers trembled as I brushed the soot away, revealing a delicate engraving on the surface. It wasn't ours. I'd never seen it before. My family had lived in this house for generations, and yet I turned it over in my palm, searching for a way to open it. Daisy sat beside me now, her tail wagging ever so slightly, but her eyes still locked on the fireplace. Carefully, I pried the locket open. Inside, there was a faded black and white photo. A little girl. Smiling, bright-eyed, her hair tied with a ribbon. And suddenly, the room felt colder. Daisy let out a quiet huff, like she'd been waiting for me to figure it out. I swallowed. "Who are you?" I whispered to the empty room. The whisper came again, this time closer. Not a whisper. A sigh. And then, just as quickly as it started, the air shifted again. The heaviness lifted, the warmth of the dying fire returning to the space. The house was still. Silent. I looked at Daisy. She was calm now. Relaxed. Whatever had held her so intensely before had passed. But I wasn't sure I'd ever feel the same again. Clutching the locket tight in my fist, I stood up and backed away from the fireplace. There was a story here. A history buried beneath the soot and stone. And Daisy had just uncovered the first piece of it. I just had to decide if I was ready to find out the rest. The weight of the locket felt heavier in my palm the longer I stood there, staring at the faded photograph. The little girl's smile was frozen in time, a memory lost in the ashes of the past. Who was she? Why had this been hidden in our fireplace? And why was Daisy acting as if she had uncovered something far greater than a simple trinket? I exhaled, turning the locket over again. There was an inscription on the back, barely legible through the rust and grime. I squinted, rubbing my thumb over the faint engraving, coaxing the words out from beneath years of soot. For Charlotte. My breath caught in my throat. Charlotte. That name didn't belong to anyone in my family, not as far as I knew. I glanced down at Daisy, who had finally settled, her front paws stretched forward and her head resting on them, her deep brown eyes still locked onto the fireplace. She wasn't panicked anymore, but she wasn't at ease either. It was like she was waiting for something. A shiver ran down my spine. I needed to know more. I needed to figure out where this locket had come from, who it had belonged to, and why Daisy had led me straight to it. I walked over to the kitchen, setting the locket down on the table and flipping on the overhead light. The yellow glow cast soft shadows around the room, and for a moment, everything felt normal again, just a quiet night in my family's home. But the locket, small as it was, carried a presence with it that I couldn't ignore. I pulled out my phone and started typing. Charlotte, history of this house. It was a long shot, but maybe something would come up. After all, our house had been built in the early 1900s. There had to be some record of its past, some trace of who had lived here before us. The search results loaded slowly. I tapped on a few links, scanning through old articles and historical records about our town. Then something caught my eye. An article from 1952. Local girl, Charlotte Whitmore, reported missing, last seen near family home. A chill passed through me. I clicked on the article, my eyes scanning the faded black and white newspaper clipping. Charlotte Whitmore. Age 7. Disappeared without a trace. The last place she had been seen was her family's home. My home. My heart pounded. I turned back to the locket, picking it up with trembling fingers. Could this really have belonged to her? Had it been hidden here all these years? Daisy lifted her head, sensing my unease. She let out a soft whimper, her tail twitching against the wooden floor. I didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made my skin prickle. The locket. The whisper. The way the air had shifted, like something unseen had been waiting, watching. I needed to dig deeper. I grabbed my laptop from the living room and brought it to the kitchen table, my fingers moving fast over the keyboard as I searched for anything I could find on Charlotte Whitmore and her family. There wasn't much, just old articles, a few missing persons reports, and a record stating that her parents had moved away a year after her disappearance, never to return. But then, buried in the archives of the local library's website, I found something else. A scanned document from 1953. A letter. To the future owner of this home, it read, "If you ever find this, please know we never stopped looking for her. We never stopped hoping she would come back. If you find any trace of her, please don't turn away. Remember her name? Charlotte." I swallowed hard. My hands trembled as I leaned back in my chair. This wasn't just an old mystery. This was something real, something alive in the very bones of this house. Daisy let out a small huff, standing up and walking over to me, resting her chin on my knee. She was looking at me as if she already knew what I had just learned. I reached down, scratching behind her ears. "You knew, didn't you?" I whispered. "You knew something was here." She wagged her tail slightly, her warm brown eyes steady and sure. I looked back at the fireplace. The embers had finally died out, leaving nothing but darkness inside the hearth. But I knew now that it wasn't empty. It had never been empty. Taking a deep breath, I made a decision. I wasn't going to ignore this. I wasn't going to let Charlotte's story fade into the past, buried in ashes and soot. I had to find out what happened to her. And somehow, I knew Daisy would help me every step of the way. The night stretched on, but sleep never came. I sat at the kitchen table, the glow of my laptop casting long shadows along the walls, while Daisy lay curled up at my feet. Every so often, her ears would twitch, her body shifting as if she could sense my racing thoughts. I kept scrolling through every article, every record, anything I could find about Charlotte Whitmore. The mystery surrounding her disappearance wasn't just another unsolved case in the town's history. It had happened here, in my house. I looked over at the fireplace again. Now that I knew what I was looking for, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was hiding beneath its soot-stained bricks. Daisy had led me to the locket, but had she sensed something more? I turned back to the old letter I'd found in the archives, rereading the words left behind by Charlotte's parents. "If you find any trace of her, please don't turn away. Remember her name, Charlotte." I needed to go back to the fireplace. Daisy lifted her head as soon as I stood up. Her tail wagged once, slow and steady, as if she already knew what I was about to do. I grabbed a flashlight from the counter and made my way into the living room. The house was silent, except for the soft creaking of the wooden floors beneath my steps. The fireplace loomed before me, dark and unassuming, but now it felt different, like it was holding on to a story that had been buried for decades. I crouched down, running my hands along the edges of the bricks. The locket had been wedged deep inside a crack, but what if there was more? I tapped lightly along the hearth, listening for any hollowness, any shift in the stone. And then, just below where the locket had been, my fingers brushed against something unusual, a brick that felt looser than the others. I hesitated, glancing at Daisy. She was watching me, her eyes sharp with anticipation. Taking a deep breath, I pressed my fingers against the loose brick and carefully pried it free. A cloud of dust filled the air, making me cough. But as the dust settled, I saw it. A small wooden box, tucked away in the hollow space behind the brick. I reached inside and carefully pulled it out, my hands trembling. The wood was worn, the edges splintered with age. There was no lock, just a simple latch holding it shut. My heart pounded as I lifted the lid. Inside, there were old papers, yellowed with time. The first was a handwritten note, the ink smudged but still legible. I carefully unfolded it and began to read. If anyone finds this, please know the truth. Charlotte didn't run away. She didn't leave us. Something happened that night. We heard her voice, but we couldn't find her. And then she was gone. We searched everywhere, but she was just gone. We never stopped looking. We never stopped hoping. My throat tightened. My fingers brushed over the signature at the bottom, Margaret Whitmore, Charlotte's mother. I set the letter aside and looked through the rest of the papers. Old photographs, Charlotte's school records, even a small fabric bow that had once been a bright shade of blue but had faded over time. I held it between my fingers, trying to picture the little girl from the locket wearing it. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, making Daisy let out a low whimper. I glanced around, my pulse quickening. The air had shifted again, just like before. Not cold, not menacing. Just different, like something unseen was pressing against the walls, whispering through the cracks. I looked down at the box in my lap. Charlotte's family had never stopped searching, never stopped believing that she was out there somewhere. But what if she had never left? What if, in some way, she was still here? I took a shaky breath and set the papers back inside the box, carefully closing the lid. I wasn't sure what to do next, but I knew one thing. I couldn't ignore this. I had to keep digging, keep searching, just like Charlotte's parents had. And somehow, I knew Daisy would be right there with me. Whatever had happened all those years ago, whatever truth had been hidden behind the bricks of this house, I was going to find it. I spent the next few hours researching old town records, diving deeper into the history of the house. Names of previous owners flashed across my screen, but none of them seemed connected to Charlotte until I stumbled upon a property deed from 1945. It listed the Whitmore family as the original owners before selling it abruptly in 1953, right after Charlotte disappeared. Why did they leave so suddenly? Why had they hidden those papers in the fireplace? I tapped my fingers against the table, my mind racing. I needed more than just newspaper clippings and speculation. I needed to find someone who had been around back then, someone who remembered. The problem was, most people from that time were long gone. But maybe, just maybe, I could find a lead. I scrolled through a list of local history groups and forums, searching for anyone who might have information on the Whitmore family. After nearly giving up, I found a post from last year. An elderly woman named Edith Lewis had commented on an article about historic homes in town. She mentioned growing up next door to the Whitmores. This was it. A real connection. I quickly scribbled down her name and address. She still lived in town, in a small house just outside the main square. Daisy nudged my leg, sensing my excitement. "We're going to pay someone a visit," I murmured, scratching behind her ears. Morning was only a few hours away. And with it, hopefully, some answers. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, but I barely noticed as I sipped on my coffee, staring at the address scribbled on my notepad. Edith Lewis. She was my best lead yet. I had spent the night tossing and turning, running through everything I had found so far. The locket, the letter, the wooden box filled with relics of a little girl who had vanished without a trace. My gut told me I was close to something big, but I needed more. Daisy sat by my feet, her tail thumping against the wooden floor, sensing my anticipation. "Come on, girl," I said, grabbing my coat. "Let's go meet Edith." The drive across town was quiet, the streets still waking up as the morning rush began. Edith's house was small, nestled between two larger homes that looked like they had been built more recently. The paint on her front porch was peeling, and the rocking chair by the door swayed slightly in the breeze. I knocked twice, my heartbeat quickening. A minute later, the door creaked open, and a frail woman with sharp blue eyes peered out. "Yes?" "Ms. Lewis, my name is Emma. I was hoping to talk to you about the Whitmore family." Her expression didn't change, but she studied me for a long moment. "And why would a young thing like you be interested in the Whitmores?" I hesitated before answering. "I live in their old house, and I found something that belonged to Charlotte." For a moment, Edith didn't move. Then, slowly, she stepped back and held the door open. "You'd better come in." Daisy followed close as I stepped inside. The house smelled of lavender and something slightly dusty, the kind of scent that clung to old furniture and unopened books. Edith motioned for me to sit, settling herself into a chair across from me. "Tell me what you found," she said. I reached into my pocket and carefully placed the locket on the table. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw something flicker across her expression. Recognition. She picked it up with shaky fingers, turning it over as if she hadn't seen it in decades. "This was Charlotte's," she murmured. "She never took it off." I leaned forward. "Do you remember the night she disappeared?" Edith let out a slow breath. "I remember everything. I was 14 at the time, old enough to understand what was happening, but too young to do anything about it." She paused, running a hand over the locket. "Charlotte was a bright girl, always laughing, always running around. But that night something felt wrong." "What do you mean?" I asked, heart pounding. "I heard something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I woke up in the middle of the night and looked out my window. Charlotte was outside, standing by your house. She was staring at something, but I couldn't see what. I called out to her, but she didn't move. And then," she stopped, her hands shaking. "And then what?" I pressed. She swallowed hard. She turned, looked right at me, and then she was gone. One second she was there, the next she wasn't, like she had vanished into thin air. A shiver ran through me. "No one ever found her?" Edith shook her head. "They searched everywhere, the woods, the river, even tore apart the house. But there was nothing. It was like she had never existed. Her parents were devastated. They never stopped looking, not until they left town for good." I exhaled, trying to process what she had just told me. "And you never saw anything else? Never heard anything?" She hesitated. "There was one thing," she admitted. "A few days after Charlotte disappeared, I was in my backyard. I thought I heard crying, a little girl's cry. It was coming from your house. But when I ran over, the place was empty. Your grandparents had just moved in at the time, and they didn't know anything about what had happened." Daisy let out a low whimper, as if she, too, sensed the weight of the moment. I looked down at the locket, my mind spinning. "Do you think she's still there?" Edith's gaze met mine, something old and knowing in her expression. "I don't know, dear. But if she is, she's been waiting a long time." I left Edith's house, with more questions than answers. The drive back felt surreal, the town around me moving as normal while my mind raced. If Charlotte hadn't run away, if she had just disappeared, what did that mean? And if her presence was still lingering in my house, what was she trying to tell me? Back home, I stood in front of the fireplace, the locket cold in my hand. I had uncovered pieces of the past, but I needed more. I needed to find the truth, no matter what it was. And somehow, I knew Daisy and I weren't alone in this house. The afternoon light cast long shadows through the living room as I sat on the floor in front of the fireplace. The locket rested in my palm, the metal cool against my skin. Daisy lay beside me, her eyes flicking between me and the empty hearth. I could feel her anticipation, the same kind of tension I felt coiling in my own chest. Edith's words echoed in my head. If Charlotte was still here, she had been waiting a long time. I needed to do something. I retrieved the wooden box from the kitchen table and carefully opened it again. The yellowed papers crinkled under my touch as I sifted through them, searching for anything I might have overlooked. A school record, a family portrait, an old note from Charlotte's mother, Margaret Whitmore. My fingers traced the faded ink. We never stopped looking. Neither would I. I exhaled, gathering my thoughts. If Edith had seen Charlotte outside that night, then something must have drawn her out. I stood and moved toward the window, looking at the backyard. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their bare branches scratching at the sky. I had spent countless afternoons out there, but now it felt different, like a part of the past still lingered, waiting to be acknowledged. Daisy followed me as I stepped outside. The crisp air filled my lungs as I walked toward the back of the house, scanning the yard. There had to be something here, something that connected Charlotte's disappearance to this place. The ground beneath the oak tree was uneven, patches of dirt scattered between tufts of grass. I crouched down, running my hand over the cold earth. Daisy sniffed at the base of the tree, her tail flicking as she whined softly. "What is it, girl?" I murmured, brushing away a layer of leaves. Beneath them, the edge of something hard caught my fingers. I dug my nails into the dirt, pulling away at the loose soil until I uncovered a small, rusted tin box. My pulse quickened. I hesitated only a second before prying it open. Inside was a folded piece of paper, delicate with age. I carefully unfolded it, my breath catching as I read the faded handwriting. I hear her. Every night. She calls my name. I don't know where she is, but she's close. I know she is. Please, if you find this, don't stop looking for her. No signature. No explanation. But I knew it had to be from Margaret Whitmore. She had hidden this, left it buried beneath the oak tree as some desperate plea for help. Daisy let out a sharp bark, startling me. She was facing the house now, her ears perked, her stance rigid. And then I heard it. A faint sound carried on the wind, barely more than a whisper. My name. My blood ran cold. I turned, heart hammering in my chest, but the yard was empty. The house stood silent, unmoving. I swallowed hard. Charlotte. The whisper came again, softer this time. It didn't feel menacing. If anything, it felt sad, like a plea. I clutched the note in my hand and stood, stepping cautiously toward the house. Daisy stayed close, her body tense as we moved. The back door creaked as I pushed it open, my footsteps echoing in the quiet house. Everything looked the same, but the air felt different. I walked to the fireplace, pressing my hand against the cool brick. "I'm listening," I whispered. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing, the quiet hum of the world outside. Then, ever so faintly, the smell of lavender filled the air. Margaret Whitmore's favorite perfume. I turned, the weight of the past pressing down on me. This wasn't just a mystery to solve. This was a promise. A little girl had disappeared, a family had been shattered, and someone, was still waiting. And I was going to find her. The air inside the house felt heavier now, charged with something unseen. I stood by the fireplace, my fingers still pressed against the cold bricks, the faint scent of lavender lingering around me. Daisy stayed close, her body pressed against my leg, ears perked and alert. I had heard my name, not in a way that made me afraid, but in a way that filled me with certainty. Charlotte was still here. Or at least, something of her was. And she was waiting for me to find her. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think. The tin box I had found beneath the oak tree had been left there on purpose. Margaret Whitmore had been searching, hoping, pleading. She must have known something others hadn't. Something she couldn't share publicly. But why? What had kept her silent? I moved back to the kitchen table, spreading out everything I had collected so far. The locket, the notes, the photograph of Charlotte. I stared at them, willing the pieces to form a complete picture. But something was still missing. If Charlotte hadn't run away, and if she hadn't simply disappeared, then something had happened that night to take her away. Something right here in this house. A floorboard creaked behind me. I froze. Daisy let out a soft whine, turning her head toward the sound. I spun around, expecting what? A shadow? A figure standing in the dim light of the living room? But there was nothing. Just the same space I had lived in for years, unchanged, except for the way it now felt so undeniably different. I moved toward the sound, slowly, cautiously, my bare feet pressing against the wooden floor. The old boards had always creaked, especially in the winter, but this wasn't the usual settling of the house. This was something else. A direction. A guide. The sound had come from the hallway leading to the basement. My heart pounded as I reached for the light switch, flicking it on. The dim bulb overhead cast a yellowish glow down the narrow staircase. I hesitated. I had been down there hundreds of times. It was just a basement. Just old storage boxes, a few shelves of canned food, my dad's old workbench. But suddenly, it felt like something more. Daisy stayed close as I stepped onto the first stair, her nails clicking softly against the wood. I swallowed hard, gripping the handrail as I descended. The air grew cooler with each step, the scent of earth and dust thick around me. I reached the bottom, pausing as I looked around. Everything was just as I had left it. The shelves were lined with forgotten holiday decorations, rusted tools, a few broken appliances we had meant to fix but never did. But something pulled at me, a quiet insistence, a whisper I couldn't hear but could feel. I stepped forward, my eyes scanning the room. And then I saw it, the old wooden wardrobe against the far wall. It had been here forever, long before my parents bought the house. It was too heavy to move, too bulky to bother with, so it had stayed put, collecting dust in the corner of the basement. But now, standing before it, I felt the weight of its presence in a way I never had before. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the wood. The air around me felt charged, electric, my breath catching in my throat as I grasped the handles and pulled. The doors groaned open. The scent of lavender flooded my senses. Daisy let out a low, uncertain growl. And inside the wardrobe, tucked between layers of moth-eaten fabric, was another box, smaller than the first, older, more fragile. My hands shook as I lifted it out, carefully setting it on the workbench. Daisy sat beside me, her body tense, as if she, too, knew we were about to uncover something long forgotten. I took a deep breath and opened the box. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. A letter. I carefully unfolded it, my eyes scanning the words written in delicate, slanted handwriting. I tried to hide her. I tried to keep her safe. But they found us. They took her away. I don't know where. I don't know if she's still. I only hope someone will find this. Someone who will remember. No name. No signature. Just the words, as desperate and lost as the scent of lavender that still clung to the air. I swallowed hard, my pulse thudding in my ears. Who had written this? And what did it mean? Someone had hidden Charlotte. Someone had tried to keep her safe. But from who? Daisy nudged my hand, bringing me back to the present. I folded the letter carefully, setting it back inside the box. My mind reeled with possibilities, with questions that had no answers. Yet, I wasn't done searching. I wouldn't stop looking. Charlotte was still here, and I was going to find her. The house felt different now, as though it had woken up after years of slumber. Every creak in the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the window felt like something, or someone, was stirring. The letter in my hands felt weightier than the paper it was written on, its words carrying the weight of a story unfinished. Daisy sat beside me, her body tense but ready, waiting for whatever came next. I knew I couldn't stop here. If someone had tried to protect Charlotte, if they had failed, then I needed to find out why. More importantly, I needed to find out from whom. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the small wooden box. My fingers trembled slightly as I shut the lid. The wardrobe loomed open before me, its presence no longer just a forgotten piece of furniture in the basement, but a doorway to something deeper, something hidden. I ran my hand along the inside walls of the wardrobe, pressing against the wood. Years of dust clung to my fingertips, but beneath the grime I felt something odd. A slight indentation, almost imperceptible, a seam where there shouldn't be one. My pulse quickened. I pressed harder, pushing against the hidden panel. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of old hinges and shifting weight, a small section of the back wall gave way, revealing a narrow gap. My breath caught in my throat. Daisy let out a low whimper. I reached for my flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the dust as I peered inside. The gap wasn't large, just enough for someone small to squeeze through. A child. My stomach twisted at the thought. Had Charlotte been hidden here? Had she crawled into this dark space, waiting to be found, only for no one to come? The air inside was stale, untouched for decades. I took a deep breath and reached inside, feeling around the enclosed space. My fingers brushed against something cold. Metal. I pulled it out. A small key, rusted but still intact. I turned it over in my palm. A key to what? Daisy's ears perked, and she suddenly turned toward the stairs, her body going rigid. A moment later, I heard it too. A faint sound. Footsteps? No, something softer. A creak. A whisper of movement upstairs. I sucked in a breath, my grip tightening around the key. I wasn't alone. Heart pounding, I stood up, carefully closing the wardrobe. My flashlight shook slightly as I made my way toward the basement stairs, Daisy close behind. Each step felt heavier, as though I were wading through something unseen. The house was watching, waiting. I reached the top and stepped into the hallway. The silence pressed against my ears. Everything was as I had left it. The fireplace, the scattered papers on the kitchen table, the empty living room. But something had changed. I followed the feeling, moving toward the front door. It was locked, just as I had left it. I checked the windows, nothing. But when I turned toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms, I stopped cold. The door to my parents' old room was open, wide open. I knew I had closed it. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped closer. The air inside the room felt colder, as if the temperature had dropped only in that space. The curtains were still, the bed untouched. But something was here. I could feel it. I hesitated at the threshold. "Charlotte?" My voice was barely more than a whisper. Nothing. Then, just as I was about to step inside, a sound stopped me. A faint scraping, like something shifting against wood. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The closet. Slowly, I turned my flashlight toward it. The door was closed, but the space beneath it was dark. Too dark, as if it swallowed the light whole. Daisy let out a quiet growl, her stance firm. I took a slow, steady breath and reached for the handle. The door creaked as it opened. The closet was empty. Or at least, it should have been. At first, all I saw were old boxes, coats that hadn't been worn in years. But then my eyes landed on the floorboards. One of them was slightly lifted, pried loose just enough to be noticeable. I crouched down, my hands shaking as I reached for it. The wood was brittle, almost soft with age. I pulled it up, revealing a small, dark space beneath. And inside, there was another note. The paper was aged, almost crumbling at the edges. I lifted it carefully, unfolding it as Daisy pressed close to my side. The handwriting was rushed, frantic, desperate. "I can hear them. They know where she is. I don't have much time. If you find this, please, don't let them take her." My hands tightened around the note. A weight settled in my chest. Whoever had written this had been trying to protect Charlotte. But from who? And why had no one ever spoken about this? A soft creak echoed through the hallway. I wasn't alone. I shoved the note into my pocket and stood, my heart hammering in my chest. My flashlight flickered as I turned toward the door, listening, waiting. Then, just beyond the doorway, I heard it again. A whisper. My name. And this time, it was closer. The whisper sent a cold shiver down my spine. I turned sharply, my flashlight casting a shaky glow down the hallway. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though it was pressing in from all sides. Daisy stood rigid beside me, her ears pricked, her body tense. She could feel it, too. I swallowed hard and stepped forward, my pulse thudding in my ears. My breath came out in short, uneven puffs as I scanned the dark corners of the hallway. I wasn't imagining this. I knew that now. Something, someone was here. The whisper had been so close. Daisy let out a low whine as I edged closer to my bedroom. The door was ajar, just barely, as though someone had nudged it open. I knew I hadn't left it like that. My fingers tightened around the flashlight, my knuckles aching from the grip. I pushed the door fully open, my pulse hammering. The room was exactly as I had left it, but the air inside felt colder, the temperature dropping sharply as I stepped through the doorway. My bed was undisturbed, my desk just as cluttered as before. But my closet door, it was open. I stopped in my tracks. It had been closed earlier. I was sure of it. My stomach knotted as I stepped toward it, Daisy close on my heels. The light from my flashlight trembled against the darkness inside, illuminating hanging clothes and old boxes stacked haphazardly on the floor. And then I saw it, a footprint, faint but visible in the dust, pressed into the wooden floorboards. Small. A child's. My breath caught in my throat. I crouched down, my fingers tracing the tiny imprint. It couldn't have been mine. It was too small, too delicate. A gust of cold air blew past me, and I turned sharply, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The window was shut, no draft, no explanation. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Daisy growled softly, stepping in front of me protectively. I rose to my feet, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Charlotte?" I whispered. Silence. Then, barely audible, a soft creak from the hallway. I spun, flashlight beam slicing through the shadows. The hallway was empty, but the door to the attic, the one that had been shut for years, was slightly open. I hesitated. I had never been up there. It had always been just another forgotten space in the house, filled with old boxes and things no one needed anymore. But something told me I had to go up there now. Daisy let out another whimper, pressing close to my leg. I steadied my breathing, forcing my feet forward step by step until I was standing in front of the attic door. I placed a hand against the wood. It was ice cold to the touch. With a deep breath, I pushed it open. The hinges groaned, protesting years of neglect. The darkness inside swallowed the weak glow of my flashlight, revealing only the first few steps leading up into the unknown. Dust motes swirled in the air, catching the light as I slowly began to climb. Each step creaked beneath my weight. The scent of old wood and forgotten memories filled my nose as I reached the top. The attic was just as I had expected. Cluttered with old trunks, furniture draped in sheets, the air thick with dust. But then I saw it. A small wooden chair in the middle of the attic floor, facing the far wall. And on it, a single doll. It was old, its porcelain face cracked, one glass eye missing. The dress it wore was faded blue, the fabric fraying at the edges. I felt my stomach tighten. Something about it felt familiar, as though I had seen it before. Daisy let out a low growl, the fur along her back rising. I stepped closer, my fingers brushing against the edge of the chair. As soon as I touched it, a whisper, close, right by my ear. "Help me." I gasped and stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The attic plunged into darkness. My heart slammed against my ribs as I scrambled for the light, my hands shaking. When I finally grabbed it and flicked it back on, the beam swept wildly across the room. The doll was gone. The chair was empty. Daisy barked, her body tense, her gaze locked on the farthest corner of the attic. My breath came fast and shallow as I followed her stare. There was nothing there. Just shadows. But I knew better now. I wasn't just chasing an old mystery. Charlotte was still here. And she needed me to find her. The attic was still, the air thick with dust, and the faint scent of lavender that had begun to feel all too familiar. My pulse hammered in my ears as I swept the flashlight beam across the room again. The doll was gone. The chair sat empty, as if no one had been there at all. But I knew better. Something had moved it. Someone had whispered in my ear. Daisy's low growl brought me back to the present. She stood at the entrance of the attic, her muscles tense, her eyes locked on the darkest corner of the room. I followed her gaze, every hair on my arms standing on end. "Charlotte," I whispered, my voice barely carried in the thick air. Nothing. I swallowed hard, stepping forward. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight. Daisy hesitated before following, her growl subsiding into a low whimper. She was afraid, and I couldn't blame her. My hands trembled as I adjusted my grip on the flashlight. I needed to see what was in that corner. Something was there. I could feel it. The light landed on an old wooden trunk pushed against the wall. It was covered in dust, the edges of the lid slightly warped with age. I hesitated only a moment before kneeling in front of it. My fingers traced the surface, clearing a thin layer of dust as I searched for a latch. Daisy let out a sharp bark, startling me. I froze, my heart hammering. But nothing moved. The attic remained still. Only the sound of my ragged breathing filled the silence. I exhaled and pressed my fingers under the lid, lifting it slowly. The hinges groaned in protest, and the smell of aged paper and cedar filled my nose. My flashlight illuminated the inside, a collection of old books, letters tied with faded ribbon, and at the very bottom a small bundle of fabric. I reached inside, pulling the bundle out carefully. As I unwrapped it, my breath caught in my throat. It was a child's dress, pale blue, the fabric worn and fragile, the same shade of blue as the doll's dress. A chill crawled up my spine. Had this belonged to Charlotte? My fingers found something stiff beneath the folds of fabric. A small envelope, yellowed with time. I hesitated, then carefully tore it open. The paper inside was brittle. The ink faded, but still legible. If you find this, please don't forget her. She didn't run. She didn't leave. She was taken. My breath hitched. The words burned into my mind. Taken. The letter didn't say by who or why, but it confirmed what I had feared. Charlotte hadn't simply disappeared. Someone had made her disappear. Daisy whined, pressing against my side. I could feel the tension in her body, the way she stayed close as if shielding me from something unseen. I clutched the letter in my shaking hands, trying to make sense of it all. If she had been taken, then someone in this town had known all along. A sudden noise shattered the silence. A thud. Not from the attic, but from downstairs. I stiffened, heart racing. Daisy growled low in her throat, her ears pinned back. Someone was in the house. I shoved the letter into my pocket and stood, my legs unsteady beneath me. I turned off the flashlight, not wanting to give away my position, and moved silently toward the attic entrance. Daisy stayed by my side, her breathing quick and shallow. Another noise. This time, closer. My mind raced. Who would be here at this hour? Was it possible someone had been watching me? Had I gotten too close to the truth? I reached the attic door, pausing to listen. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving through the hallway below. I swallowed hard and stepped onto the stairs, careful to avoid the creaky spots. My fingers clenched around the flashlight like a weapon. I didn't know who or what I was about to face, but I wasn't running. Daisy let out a soft growl, pressing against my leg as we reached the second floor. I held my breath, peering down the hallway. The dim light from the street lamp outside cast long shadows along the floorboards. The house was silent again, but I knew someone was here. A sudden movement caught my eye, a flicker of motion near the living room. I turned sharply, my pulse spiking. And then I saw her. A figure. Small. Barefoot. Standing just beyond the doorway. Charlotte. I gasped, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The little girl stood motionless, her pale dress barely visible in the dim light. Her face was turned away, her long hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. Charlotte? My voice cracked, barely above a whisper. She didn't move. Daisy's growl deepened, but she didn't lunge. She stayed at my side, watching. waiting. I took a hesitant step forward. "I want to help you." At that, she shifted slightly. Her head turned just enough for me to see her face. My blood ran cold. It wasn't Charlotte. The girl's features were wrong, her skin too pale, her eyes too dark. And when she smiled, it was empty. Hollow. A whisper filled the air, so soft I almost didn't hear it. "You shouldn't have come back." The room tilted. My breath caught in my chest as the shadows stretched, deepened. The figure took a step closer, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Daisy barked, a sharp warning sound that shattered the moment. The figure jerked backward, vanishing into the darkness. I stumbled, my legs giving out as I collapsed to my knees. My breath came in ragged gasps. The room was empty again. Silent, but I could still feel it. A presence. Watching. Waiting. My hands trembled as I reached for the letter in my pocket. She didn't run. She didn't leave. She was taken. And now, I knew someone, or something, didn't want me to find out why. I clutched the letter so tightly that the edges began to tear. The house had grown deathly silent, but the cold presence lingered. My mind raced with questions. Who was that girl? What had she meant by saying I shouldn't have come back? And most pressing of all, where was Charlotte? I wanted to move, but my legs felt locked, like the room itself was holding me in place. Daisy stayed close, her growls subsiding into soft, nervous whimpers. She was unsettled, just like me. But she didn't run. She stayed, her warm body against mine giving me the strength to steady my breathing. I needed to think. The letter's words burned in my mind. She didn't run. She didn't leave. She was taken. And whoever had left this message clearly believed someone else knew what had happened to Charlotte. My search wasn't just about finding her anymore. I was piecing together a story that someone, or something, didn't want told. Slowly, I rose to my feet. The hallway was empty now, the light from my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. I felt that familiar pressure in the air again, not as oppressive as before, but still present, like a pair of eyes just out of view. I needed to regroup, find another clue. If the girl, or whatever that was, had appeared, then she was trying to stop me from going further. But why? What was it she didn't want me to uncover? Daisy trotted behind me as I headed back to the living room. The notes, the locket, and the photograph of Charlotte were still on the table. I stared at them, trying to draw a line between the pieces. Edith's memory of Charlotte standing outside that night. The hidden wardrobe panel and the tiny key. The blue dress, so similar to the one the doll had worn. And now, this ghostly figure who had warned me away. I had too many questions, and not enough answers. Then I remembered the key. I pulled it from my pocket, turning it over in my hand. It was small, rusted, and looked like it belonged to something old. But what? The trunk in the attic hadn't had a lock. Neither had the wardrobe. This key must go to something else, something I hadn't found yet. Daisy barked sharply, her tail stiff. She was staring at the fireplace again. I froze, my hand tightening around the key. The fire had burned out completely now, leaving only a faint layer of ash. I stepped closer, crouching down as I scanned the hearth. Was there another hidden compartment? Another clue tucked away beneath the soot? I ran my hands along the bricks, pressing against the mortar and feeling for anything out of place. My fingers brushed over one brick that shifted slightly. My pulse quickened as I pushed it further. Slowly, it gave way, revealing a small, hollow space behind it. Inside was another box, smaller than the first, but no less intriguing. I pulled it out carefully and set it on the floor. The lid was locked. I held up the rusted key. Could this be it? With trembling fingers, I inserted the key into the lock. It was a perfect fit. The mechanism resisted at first, then clicked open. I lifted the lid, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside was a bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. I untied it carefully, lifting the top letter. The handwriting was faint, the ink faded by time, but I could still make it out. If you find this, please know we tried everything we could. We hid her because we thought it was the only way to keep her safe. But they came anyway. They knew where to look. They knew we were lying. Charlotte didn't run away. She was taken from us. And whoever took her, they were watching us the whole time. I felt a chill run down my spine. My eyes darted to Daisy. She stared at me intently, her body alert. It wasn't just that Charlotte had been taken. Someone had been watching the family, the people who had lived here, maybe even watching me now. I pulled out the rest of the letters, scanning each one quickly. They were all the same. A desperate account of trying to protect Charlotte, of hiding her in different places, of fearing that they would come. The writers never identified who they were, only that they were dangerous, that they wouldn't stop, and that they knew too much. A shiver coursed through me. I placed the letters back in the box and shut it. I was getting closer to the truth, but it was clear now that the truth was something others had fought to bury, even if it meant risking their lives. I turned back to the fireplace, staring into the empty hearth. What had started as a simple curiosity about Daisy's strange behavior had turned into something far bigger, something that went back decades. Charlotte's story was tangled in fear, in secrecy, and in something darker that I couldn't yet understand. And now, it was up to me to uncover what everyone else had hidden. I rose to my feet, clutching the box and the key. This wasn't over. It felt as though I was only just beginning to unravel the web that had been spun around Charlotte's disappearance. And as I stood there, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on me, I realized something else. If I wanted answers, I would have to keep digging. I would have to confront the shadows that had been cast over this house, over this family, and over Charlotte herself. And I wouldn't stop until I found her. The night deepened, and the house fell silent once again. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It was heavy, thick, as though the air itself held its breath. The flickering light from my flashlight barely cut through the darkness as I stood in the living room, my hands trembling slightly. Daisy remained at my side, her body tense but loyal. She didn't whimper or growl now. She simply watched me, waiting. I sat down at the kitchen table, laying the newly uncovered letters alongside the locket, the photograph, and the first set of notes. My eyes scanned the words over and over, searching for some detail I might have missed. Each letter spoke of fear, of hiding Charlotte, and of someone who was always watching. There was an urgency in the handwriting that grew more frantic with each note. The key, now unlocked from its purpose, sat beside the box. It had opened one more chapter of this dark history, but the story was far from over. If these letters were true, and I had no reason to doubt them, then Charlotte hadn't simply been a victim of chance. She'd been targeted. But by who? And why? I tapped my fingers on the table, trying to piece it all together. If the family had known they were being watched, Why hadn't they gone to the authorities? What could have been so terrifying, so unrelenting, that they'd resort to hiding their daughter in secret compartments and attic trunks? As the question swirled in my mind, I felt it again. That subtle shift in the air. A presence, faint but undeniable, brushing past me like a whisper. I turned quickly, the flashlight's beam darting across the room. Nothing. Only the stillness of the house. Daisy stirred, her head lifting, ears perked. She sensed it too. She got up and moved toward the hallway, her nails clicking softly against the floorboards. I hesitated, but when she looked back at me, it was as if she was urging me to follow. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I rose and followed her. She led me past the attic stairs, down the hallway to the small bedroom that had once belonged to my parents. The door was closed, just as I had left it, but the air around it felt colder, heavier. I placed a hand on the doorknob, hesitating. Daisy stood beside me, her tail low, her body alert. I turned the knob slowly, pushing the door open. The room was untouched. The bed was still made, the curtains drawn, the dresser covered in a thin layer of dust. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. My flashlight swept across the room, pausing at the closet door. It was shut tightly, just as I had left it earlier. But the sense of presence was stronger here, more concentrated. I took a slow, deep breath and moved toward it. I opened the closet door. Inside were old coats, boxes of forgotten belongings, and an array of small items that hadn't been touched in years. But at the back, tucked into the corner, was something I hadn't noticed before. A small wooden panel that didn't quite match the rest of the closet's interior. I knelt down, brushing my fingers over it. It was loose, as though it had been removed and replaced many times. Carefully, I pried it away, revealing a narrow gap behind it. The flashlight's beam illuminated the space, and I saw what looked like a small box wrapped in layers of cloth. My hands trembled as I reached inside, pulling it out gently. The cloth was faded and brittle, but it had been carefully tied. I untied it, uncovering a metal tin, the paint chipped and rusted. I opened it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside was a stack of photographs. I flipped through them one by one, each image black and white, each capturing a moment long past. They showed a little girl playing in a garden, smiling in front of the house, holding a doll that looked just like the one I had seen in the attic. It was Charlotte. She looked so happy, so full of life. But as I continued to sort through the photographs, I noticed something. In the background of several images, there was a figure. At first it was faint, almost unnoticeable, but in each successive photo, the figure became clearer. A man. Always standing in the distance, watching. His face was never fully visible, but his presence was unmistakable. He wore a dark coat, his posture stiff, his gaze locked on the girl. My stomach twisted. These photographs weren't just family keepsakes. They were evidence. Someone had been watching Charlotte long before she disappeared. Someone who was always nearby, always in the background. Daisy let out a soft bark, snapping me out of my thoughts. I looked at her, and she was staring intently at the closet. I turned back and realized the air had grown even colder. A faint sound reached my ears, like a distant whisper, too soft to understand. I froze, listening. Then I heard it again. A voice. A child's voice. And it was calling my name. My heart raced as I stood, the photographs still clutched in my hand. I shone the flashlight into the closet, searching for the source of the sound. The whisper came again, faint but clear, coming from deeper within the closet's hidden compartment. I moved the flashlight around, finally landing on a small, narrow tunnel at the very back. It was just wide enough for someone to crawl through. My pulse quickened. This was new, something I hadn't found before. Was this where they had tried to hide Charlotte? "Charlotte?" I called softly. The whispering stopped. Daisy growled low in her throat, but she didn't back away. She stayed close as I crouched down, peering into the tunnel. The beam of light barely reached the end. It curved slightly, disappearing into darkness. I hesitated. Crawling into a dark, narrow tunnel was the last thing I wanted to do. But if this was where Charlotte had been hidden, then it was the only place I could go. I placed the photographs back into the tin and left it on the closet floor. Then, flashlight in hand, I began to crawl. The air grew colder as I moved further inside. The walls of the tunnel were rough, the ground uneven. The scent of earth and something faintly sweet, lavender, hung in the air. Daisy's nails scraped the floor behind me as she followed. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the beam of my flashlight unable to reveal what lay ahead. The whispers grew louder, echoing faintly around me. The voice was still calling my name, pulling me forward. And then, the tunnel opened up into a small, hidden room. My breath caught as I looked around. The space was cramped, the walls lined with old, crumbling bricks. In the center of the room was a wooden chair, much like the one I had seen in the attic. And on it was the doll. I stared at it, my heart pounding. The doll's cracked face seemed to watch me, its single glass eye reflecting the beam of my flashlight. The whispers had stopped. The air was deathly still. "Charlotte," I whispered. No answer, just the heavy silence. I stepped closer, reaching out to touch the doll. My fingers brushed against its worn fabric, and a sudden wave of cold swept through the room. The whispering returned, louder now, more insistent. I turned, my flashlight catching movement in the corner. There, in the shadows, stood a figure. Small, barefoot, a little girl in a pale dress. Charlotte. Her face was pale, her expression distant. She didn't move, didn't speak. She simply stared at me, her dark eyes holding something I couldn't quite understand. "Charlotte," I said again, my voice trembling. "I'm here to help you." She tilted her head slightly, as if considering my words. Then slowly she raised her hand and pointed behind me. I turned, the flashlight beam swinging toward the far wall. There, carved into the bricks, was a name. Margaret Whitmore. My breath hitched. Margaret had been Charlotte's mother. But what did this mean? Why was her name carved here? Was this room meant for her as well? When I turned back, Charlotte was gone. The doll still sat on the chair, its cracked face turned slightly toward me as if it had been watching the whole time. Daisy barked sharply, her body tense. I backed away, the weight of the room pressing against me. This place held secrets, but it also held something far darker. I could feel it. I needed to leave. I needed to make sense of what I had found. But I knew one thing for certain. Charlotte wasn't gone. She was still here, and she was waiting for me to finish what her family had started. The air grew colder the deeper I ventured into the house's history. The name Margaret Whitmore stayed etched in my mind, haunting every step I took. Who was she beyond being Charlotte's mother? What had happened to her, and why was her name carved into the wall of that hidden room? And what did it mean that Charlotte had appeared, if only for a fleeting moment, before disappearing again? Back in the kitchen, I laid out all the items I had collected so far. The letters tied with the faded blue ribbon, the photographs with the dark figure lingering in the background, the locket still cold to the touch, and now the memory of that childlike whisper that led me into the tunnel. Daisy remained close, as she always did. Her steady presence was a comfort, though her tension mirrored my own. She sensed the shifts in the house just as much as I did. I ran a hand down her back, trying to calm both of us. I needed more than scattered clues. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but too much was missing. I pulled out my laptop, fingers trembling as I typed Margaret Whitmore into the search bar. Most of the results were unrelated, tangents into genealogy or similar names from different states. But I found a local historical archive that referenced an old article. Margaret Whitmore's Tragedy, the disappearance of Charlotte, and the lingering mystery of the Whitmore family. I clicked, my heart pounding. The article was dated nearly 50 years ago. It recounted how Margaret Whitmore had pleaded for help from the community after her daughter vanished. Friends described her as a devoted mother who became increasingly paranoid in the months leading up to Charlotte's disappearance. Some claimed Margaret had hinted at threats from unknown individuals. Others dismissed her as delusional. She'd isolated herself, rarely leaving the house, until one day she too was gone. The family's home, the very house I now lived in, had changed hands several times after that. The article mentioned strange occurrences, rumors of ghosts, and unsettling sounds that plagued later occupants. Some left within weeks. Others boarded up certain parts of the house entirely. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the screen lighting the dark kitchen. The parallels were too strong. Margaret's fear of someone watching her, her attempts to hide Charlotte, the whispered warnings I'd heard, the faint sounds that always seemed to pull me closer to the truth. Whoever had taken Charlotte might have been after Margaret too. I dug deeper, scanning through digitized documents, old letters, and scanned microfilm images. One handwritten note caught my attention. It wasn't signed, but it was addressed to Margaret. You can't keep her hidden forever. We know where she is, and we will come for her. The words sent a chill down my spine. It was short, threatening, and direct. Margaret had been right to be afraid, but of whom? The article offered no further leads on the identity of the people who had stalked her. It didn't confirm what happened to her after Charlotte vanished. It was as though both mother and daughter had been swallowed whole by something much larger than themselves. I turned my gaze to Daisy. "This is bigger than we thought, girl," I whispered. She let out a soft huff, then rested her head on my lap. I scratched her ears absent-mindedly, my mind spinning with possibilities. If Margaret's name was carved into that hidden wall, maybe there were other hidden messages elsewhere. Maybe someone had left more clues. I grabbed my flashlight again, its beam cutting through the darkness as I moved room to room. The air was colder now, the weight of the house pressing down on me. Every creak of the floorboards set my nerves on edge. In the living room, I stood in front of the fireplace again. It had become a focal point, a nexus of everything strange and unexplainable. I ran my hand along the mantel, feeling for anything out of place. The surface was smooth, covered in dust, but my fingers brushed against something etched into the wood on the underside. I crouched down, angling the flashlight to see. There, carved into the dark wood, were faint letters. "Find the ledger." My brow furrowed. The ledger? What ledger? This was new. I hadn't seen anything resembling a ledger among the items I'd found so far. I stood, scanning the room again. Where would Margaret have hidden something like that? If it held answers, it wouldn't have been left out in the open. "Daisy, help me out here," I muttered. She perked up, her ears twitching. I moved back toward the hallway, Daisy at my heels. I tried to think like Margaret. If she had been desperate to protect her daughter, where would she have hidden the most important pieces of their story? I searched the walls for more hidden compartments, tapping lightly along the floorboards for any hollow spaces. My flashlight swept across shelves and picture frames, the dull gleam of old glass reflecting the beam. When I reached my parents' old bedroom again, Daisy stopped short. She stood in the doorway, her nose sniffing at the air. I stepped past her, scanning the room carefully. The closet door was still ajar, and the tunnel I had crawled through remained open. But there was something else. A faint scent of lavender, stronger than before. I moved toward the dresser, running my hands along the edges. One drawer stuck slightly. I tugged at it, feeling a resistance. When I finally pulled it free, I found another hidden panel at the back of the drawer. It took a moment to pry it loose, but when it came away, a thin, leather-bound ledger was tucked inside. The cover was worn, the edges frayed. I flipped it open, revealing pages filled with meticulous handwriting. Each entry detailed events, dates, and names. Margaret's writing grew more frantic as the ledger progressed. She described people she had seen lurking near the house, letters that arrived without postage, and strange sounds at night. One entry caught my eye. They know about the fireplace. They know what's hidden there. I don't have much time. I flipped through the pages faster, searching for something concrete. There were names, some crossed out, others underlined. F. Caldwell appeared repeatedly, always with notes like, "They work for them," or "They knew about the wardrobe." Who was F. Caldwell? Another entry near the end read, "I have no choice. If I don't give her up, they'll take us both. They've promised to leave me alone if I do this. I don't believe them, but I don't know what else to do." The handwriting was erratic. The ink smudged. The final entry stopped mid-sentence. "She's in the tunnel. If someone finds this, please know I only wanted to keep her safe. Please know—" And that was it. The ledger ended there. I sat back, my heart racing. Margaret had tried to protect Charlotte, but whoever was after them had been relentless. They had known every move she made. Even the fireplace had been compromised. But what had they wanted? And why had they stopped once Charlotte was taken? Daisy nuzzled my side, her warm nose pulling me out of my thoughts. I looked down at her, her deep brown eyes filled with concern. I closed the ledger gently, feeling its weight not just in my hands, but in my chest. This wasn't just a mystery. It was a tragedy. Margaret had been pushed into an impossible situation, driven by fear, and ultimately lost everything. But that didn't mean it was over. The whispers, the cold presence, and the appearance of the little girl. Something was still unresolved. Charlotte wasn't gone. Not completely. And I had to find her. I stood, clutching the ledger tightly. If Margaret had left these clues behind, then she wanted someone to finish what she couldn't. I wasn't just searching for answers anymore. I was searching for a way to set things right. Daisy stayed close as I made my way back toward the living room. The house seemed to hum around me, as though it knew I had taken another step closer to understanding. The ledger was the key, but there was still more to uncover. And I wouldn't stop until I found the truth.